designs embody his own personal passions and are revolutionary forms on an epic scale. They are angular and aggressive, with a bravura use of modern materials and innovative engineering.
Architecture, it talks to you. It talks to you through the windows, through the doors, through the sense of spaces, and it tells you something. Often the things that weren't really concentrating on, or things that were buried just under your feet, or things just beyond your movement of the eye.
Libeskind sees his buildings, although he might not say this, as complete works of art. And he is the artist who creates them. And like a sculptor or a painter, he or she will present you with their work. And it's then for you to look at, touch, feel, experience, and make of it what you will. But the artist ultimately is in control.
His buildings are some of the most important in contemporary architecture, but they tell a deeper story. Beneath these challenging and radical designs, the past is being brought dramatically to life in concrete and steel. But Libeskind's buildings are not simply conceptual gestures. Each tells a profound and passionate story that resonates with memory and history. They are striking spaces that deal with contemporary issues. They draw on Libeskind's own personal history, and in doing so address some of the most challenging and difficult themes of our age.
Daniel went from being a somewhat obscure academic architect who was forever writing obtuse, difficult, theoretical things to being the architect of one of the best-known, if not most controversial buildings in the world, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, to then being the most celebrated architect in the world when he won the Ground Zero Master Plan.
When he won the Ground Zero project in the aftermath of 9/11, Libeskind was instantly elevated to the top of his profession, drawing worldwide attention to his work and giving him enormous power and influence.
I guess every architect in the world thought that this was an incredible place. Every architect thought that this rebuilding was at the core of what architecture can contribute. It's incredible, the sky, the perfect blue sky, just like on September 11th, 2001, the same blue sky of September. This place will be transformed in a way that is inspiring and that will move people for generations to come, that this was not just a small thing. This was an attack not only on Twin Towers, on a couple of buildings. It was an attack on New York, on the very quality of life of an incredible democratic city and on the democratic world.
The reality is right now, as the culture is so much more interested in architecture, a lot of people who were mainly academics doing limited amounts of work, known as much for theory as for building, now have a lot of big building projects and have moved in stages toward the commercial world with all of its demands and pressures. And Libeskind has maybe moved faster and more dramatically than many of them, partly because of Ground Zero and the international publicity it's brought, but also he's ridden that wave that's also brought a lot of other people in that same direction. So remember, we have to see it in the context of a worldwide phenomenon in which a couple of dozen architects who were once kind of little boutique and academic architects are now big stuff.
Libeskind has become a star-architect, a star architect, famous for buildings that have had an enormous impact on both the public and the architectural community. He defines himself, though, through his family and his sense of history.
Well, if you're not touched by history, what would you be touched by? That is almost the definition of life.
His own history begins in Poland in 1946, when he was born in the town of Lodz.
My parents were Holocaust survivors who had escaped to the former Soviet Union, and they were both imprisoned as Poles and as Jews. My father, the Volga, and my mother in the gulags in Siberia. And they came back to Poland and found that no one was left, and the Iron Curtain came down, and I grew up in Poland. The city of Łódź is once a great center of Jewish life. And now yes, it's still there, but it's a remnant, ghost-like place for me, at least.
Libeskind's son, Noam, has never visited Poland before, and he has asked his father to take him on a trip to Lodz to find the apartment that Daniel lived in as a child.
What's the biggest change that you see?
There's color on the streets. There are people walking, young people. It's very different atmosphere. There are cars instead of horses.
Horses?
Yeah. But this is the main street. This is the Fifth Avenue of Łódź.
Is this it?
That's it.
This is it?
This is it. I can't recognize it, so it's so clean. But it is the same one.
It's completely different from this.
You know, this is where we lived, and this was our courtyard, and it's extraordinary. Life has come back. This structure for beating carpets is the same one still. But yeah, that's the place. This has been here 50 years. It's the same one, just been painted.
Were you friendly with your neighbors? Did you know any of your neighbors?
We knew some of the neighbors, but we were, as Jews, we were not.
No Jews lived around here?
No.
Well, no Jews lived really in Lodz in that time,
Very
right?
few. We felt that,
From a Jewish community of 200,000 to a Jewish community of
almost none.
almost none.
There was kind of poor atmosphere of some pre-war movie, and there was anti-Semitism. There was not a feeling of openness. I felt this courtyard was just about what the world was, kind of a closed box. It's difficult to describe the atmosphere in the 50s when I lived here under communists, being Jewish in the city. You know, we're not assimilated, we're not hiding it. We felt under siege. Before the war, half of the city, 1 out of every 2 people were Jews. It was Jews, Poles. It was a vibrant community, vibrant city. After the war, there was nobody. We were sort of specimens of someone who was not yet extinct, and we felt it. I was always frightened, which it was not a safe city for a small Jewish boy. The little Daniel Libeskind dreamt of getting out of that courtyard, dreamt of being somewhere else, looking beyond that wall, somewhere where you could breathe freely. It was a different world. It was, fortunately, a world that has disappeared. You don't feel it, maybe because there are no Jews here. We lived at the end of this courtyard. You know, I wanted to play the piano. And my parents said to me, they're too scared to bring the piano all this distance. You know, it's true. Had I lived only around the corner, maybe I would have played the piano. But they were scared because of the neighbors, and there were people looking, just like they're looking now, but of all the windows at the Jews. And so they said, we'll get you one. You know, hidden in a little suitcase, but it turned out not to be a piano, it turned out to be an accordion. I had Had we lived close to the gateway, perhaps I would have been a pianist. And it would have been a different life. Look what a difference just a few steps on a courtyard means. My mother was a seamstress. She had a corset and brassiere business. She had a small shop in Lodz where she made things. She had a sewing machine, a little Singer sewing machine. Let's go in. It is amazing that after all these years, this is still an underwear shop. And you know, when my mother started it, 50 years ago, there was nothing on the street. And yet, several generations later, it's still doing the same thing. She was brassiere, underwear, everything which a communist totalitarian government could not afford to make for its people because it was individual. The body was, something to be, neglected. It was just an abstraction. So my mother provided a service that was much appreciated because, it has to fit you, underwear.
Tata jak wchodził do pokoju, to zawsze miauczał, jak drzwi były zamknięte.
This is so, it's true. She knew my sister and my parents. She said, and it's true. Now, I haven't remembered it, but she said when my father used to come to a place, he would make a sound of a little cat. Meow. Like, now I remember it. It's true. It's a very bizarre thing.
A mama była tutaj.
Mama była tutaj. It was a shoe store. She was a radical. My mother had the Hasidic flame. Of passion, of belief in social justice. She, after all, threw an inkwell at a Russian general when she was incarcerated in the Gulag. She threw an inkwell at the portrait of Stalin. She could have been killed on the spot. My father was a printer, a working man, a man of great talent. He always wanted to be an artist. And, when my mother died, she told him, now you have to paint. And he did. And as an old man, in his 70s, you would think somebody would take a brush and paint, the moon or the stars or mountains or he painted highly abstracted pictures. And actually, when I saw them, I realized, it's genetic. Is there a publication with all these photographs?
Yes, they have a publication. It was also a publication in London, but also here in Łódź. It's part of them.
The faces of the Jews of the Lodz Ghetto are seen in an exhibition of private photographs taken in the years immediately before the Holocaust. At the time, the Lodz Ghetto was the biggest in Poland, having swollen to over 200,000 souls as the Nazis used it as a dumping ground for their German Jews. These are the faces of people that Libeskind's father himself may have known.
It's kind of a document of an extraordinary resonance. First of all, because as I look at it, I see people, none of them survived. And I look, there could be, one of my members of the family, I don't know them, but who knows who they are. It's amazing how much these photographs, as few as they are, reveal to us about the horrors of the tragedy, the horror of the Holocaust, documented in a very simple way here through photographs, but they're as piercing, as anguishing as anything I've ever seen in my life. Who knows? If my father was here, he was always searching in any photograph, anything that, maybe he'll find a picture of somebody he knows. He never succeeded, but he was obsessed. And, there's so little that survives, these photographs survive, that there's nothing beyond it. it's more than sad. It's a catastrophe about what happened to human beings. And it's not something abstract, you know, it's not the big numbers. It's a face of a child, it's a forced smile, it's a pose for an official photograph, while millions of people are being burned into ash, right here, where we are standing, on a sunny day.
In the late 1950s, Polish Jews were granted leave to travel to Israel, and Libeskind's dream of leaving his grey courtyard came true. He was 11 years old. He lost his Polish citizenship, however, as the communists still classed emigration as an illegal act. But Libeskind was overwhelmed by his new country.
Coming to Israel opened my eyes to the beauty of the world. My lingering memory is of a place of true, kind of utopia. What I love about Israel is the beauty of history, the discovery of history, and also modern architecture. Suddenly to see modern buildings done in a way that I never saw. The idea that life moves forward, there's progress in the world, people can live in a decent civic society and can express it. A Bauhaus building is a kind of puristic building, made of perfect curve, perfect geometries. It's a pure, stable modernity created by the human being as a believer. I'm a descendant of the Bauhaus. We stayed in Israel for about 3.5 years. And then my father was determined to come to America because out of his large family of brothers and sisters, he had only one sister who survived Auschwitz, who was in America, and we came as immigrants to America in August 28, 1959. I love New York. You know, New York was truly arriving at a place where I truly felt at home. I'm an American, of course. I'm still an Israeli. I'm a Berliner. But truly, I'm a New Yorker. New York is an amazing city, but it's not because of its individual buildings. There are very few individual buildings which are beautiful in New York. It's the whole composition of this island. There's Louis Sullivan, the grandfather of American architecture, who said, the problem with New York is that the only god they venerate is the god of money. Maybe each building is not beautiful, but the composition of New York is inspiring. And sometimes there are these high points that you really get oriented by. And you say, now that's the Chrysler Building. I know where I am. I don't even know that much about the Chrysler Building, but I've always loved it. Before even I saw it, when I saw it on a picture postcard that my father sent me, I said, I've got to see that building. And forever it stayed with me, and I'm so lucky to see it out of these windows.
A young boy in love with New York, Daniel and his family moved into the Amalgamated Housing Projects, a garment workers collective in the Bronx.
I guess we lived there because It was a place that my parents had some connection to, particularly my mother. It was a place started by working revolutionaries in the 1920s for the dignity of working people, for equality. And they were still there. And my mother got in touch, and there was a network, and we were lucky to be able to move to low-cost housing, basically, which had a wonderful park, and it was where I grew up in New York. Well, I went to high school at the Bronx High School of Science, which was a specialty school for those who had aptitudes for physics and mathematics. And thanks to my mother, I became an architect. I was sitting late one evening. This is a true story. Around the kitchen table, I said, you know, my mother, I'm going to be an artist. Despite my interest in mathematics, I always painted and drew. He said, an artist? Are you crazy? You'll be a starving person. And I said, but look at Andy Warhol. She said, Warhol? So for Andy Warhol, there's a million starving artists who can't even buy a pencil or an eraser. He said, then she said something very wise. She said, you should be an architect, you know, because it's a profession. And then she said, you can always be an artist in architecture, but you cannot be an architect in art. And she said that with the gesture, says you can catch two fish with one hook. And then in my last year of schooling in architecture, I married Nina, and then we lived a peripatetic, nomadic life of wandering Jews. I met Nina in a very strange camp, which was in upstate New York. It was a camp for survived children, who were children of the survivors of the Holocaust. And the camp was named Camp Hemshech, which in Hebrew and Yiddish means future, continuity, actually.
Can't speak, being interviewed, call you back.
And the language of the camp was Yiddish, and Nina, whose parents were not survivors of the Holocaust, although they were immigrants to Canada as Jews, came there because her friend said, you know, come and there's this guy I want you to meet. And it's true, we fell in love at first sight. That was, yes, my luck.
When we were first married, in fact, it was just a few days after we were married, Daniel was applying for jobs. Of course, he never took one. And he had to get 3 letters of recommendation. So he got a letter of recommendation from the Dean of Cooper Union, he got a letter of recommendation from Peter Eisman, and he got a letter of recommendation from Richard Meyer. And what was shocking to me is that every one of those letters used the word genius. And my dad read these letters, and he looked at me and said, my goodness, they're saying he's a genius. And I said, I don't know, maybe they're right.
The Libeskinds began to travel the world. After graduating in architecture in New York, Daniel did his postgraduate studies in England at Essex University. He then accepted a variety of academic posts in different countries. Nina and he moved more than 15 times back and forth across the ocean, always with their 3 children by their side, Lev, Noam, and Rachel.
Start partying right now.
I need something. Rachel, go and serve your mother, please. I taught architecture. Teaching is very important. It's part of the Talmud, is that teaching is an ethical duty. It's not a choice you have. Teaching is not some second-rate profession for losers or non-professionals. It's a central core of transmitting a tradition. I always pursued architecture, not as something abstract, but architecture has a tradition of drawing. I mean, drawing is the root and source of architecture, also text. I taught, I wrote, and I drew. If somebody said you can't draw anymore, I'd quit architecture.
Libeskind seemed destined for a life as an academic and teacher, but he did publish books of architectural ideas, so-called paper architecture. None of them actual buildings, all highly abstract structural designs, but the basis of his architectural style and a foretaste of what was to come.
Micromegas is a series of drawings which explored the possibilities of architecture from within the tradition of drawing. I think every architecture drawing is about building. The drawings are not just graphics to be hung ornamentally on walls. They are explorations of space. You know, I created create drawings that seem very abstract, but they are no more abstract than traditional Palladian drawings. What is an architect to do? He has to measure space. He has to create a kind of mechanism which is architectural in its essence, from which buildings can be derived. And these drawings might look very abstract to a layperson. Every one of my projects is related to these drawings. I use these drawings. They're not just hangovers from a ludicrous academic past, and that's how I still continue to use those drawings. They're created with a pen, with ink. They are not computer drawn. They are constructed. They're classical drawings, but look, when the nephew of Michelangelo asked him what to do in order to be an architect, Michelangelo, in one of his letters, said, you know, don't worry about anything. All you have to do is just draw, Antonio. Draw.
It feels to me that the Micromegas series is dealing with a lot of what he talks about to do with space without exit. The wonderful, teasing drawings which kind of almost look as if they're something else and they're not. And very much in a tradition of modernism, the modernism which comes from synthetic cubism and constructivism, etc.
I met Daniel early on, and I thought he was immensely bright, immensely entertaining intellectually. He was like a shaman, a showman, a performer. He played tricks with words and ideas. Then, having spoken to him about his drawings and saying, gosh, this looks like crazy abstract modern music being written, then you discover, well, he was a musician and is a musician. And then you discover, well, yes, also a performer. And once you see that little boy up there playing his piano accordion in front of audiences in Israel and in the States, you can start to see that a supreme entertainer at work, an entertainer who is then going to get serious and build.
Of course, architecture can only be derived from its own means. It's not a literary language, it's not a musical language purely, it's not a social language. It's created with its own materials, walls and weights and gravity.
Dan is a musician and a performer, and his buildings, I suppose, are very much pieces of abstract music. He loves both the great abstract composers of the 20th century, and of course he loves the great Baroque masters. And his buildings, I suppose, in musical terms, are the meeting of those two. There's both a rigorous geometrical form that Bach could have understood perfectly, and that is the basis of all architecture from the very beginning of architecture several thousand years ago. And then he adds in his own late 20th century and 21st century doubt and abstraction, and all those certainties that Bach seems to have had. I'm sure he didn't, I'm sure he questioned as much as anybody, but they appear to be certain. Danny raises the uncertainty in his drawings, and then in concrete and windows that zig and zag and zag and zig.
I never considered myself a theoretical architect. Curiously enough, even though I sat at a desk with a pen and pencil and drew drawings that seemed to be looking for life somewhere, I did not think of myself as theorizing. I thought, this is architecture when you don't have a client. I never designed even a theoretical building because I thought you can't. But I pursued architecture in other ways.
It wasn't really until he started winning competitions, and obviously building Berlin, when was that, 89, something like that, that one saw that this was true. I mean, he actually was going to do it.
Oh, Superman. With supreme irony, Libeskind's first building was to be in Berlin, the epicenter of the Holocaust. After 20 years of theoretical architecture, the course of his life changed as he entered and won the competition to build the Jüdische Abteilung, the Jewish department of the Berlin Museum. His designs were striking, abstract, and revolutionary, and they would take over a decade to be realized, leaving him in his 50s when it finally opened.
I was, I think, 52 years old when the Jewish Museum was realized. It is true that winning the competition for the Jewish Museum, it was the kind of the easiest part of it. Because winning a competition, what is it? A ticket to oblivion. You know, it's a hoopla. This building was not coincidental that it took 12, 13 years to be built. It's not because it's technically complicated, because to create the will, to redefine, to come to grips with Jewish history in Berlin was the project itself. The turning point happened on a street in Berlin when we had come here only on our way to the Getty, where I had been invited as a Getty scholar, a great privilege. You don't apply for it. We had just stopped in Berlin to pick up the prize, you know, see the big exhibition. And Nina said to me, "What are you going to do?" And I was very perplexed by that question. And suddenly, I understood that there was a crossroads in my life. What was I going to do? And I said to her, "Berlin." And I said, under one condition. And she said, "What?" I said, "That you join me in this." And she said, "What am I going to do? I'm not an architect. And I've never even been in an architect's office." And I said, "That's the same thing for me."
For quite a while at the beginning, I didn't have much to say or talk about the architecture because we had only the Jewish Museum that we were working on. As time went on, I became more courageous, and I think our working relationship became more symbiotic and more relaxed, so that I could actually begin to comment about the things that I felt were going in the wrong direction or hadn't been handled properly. Now, I'm not an architect, and it's really enormous chutzpah of me to comment on the substantive amount of drawing and thinking that Daniel does, but the communication of that, the ability to sort of be the person who would stand back and say, "This doesn't look right to me," or "This is far too complex," or "This is far too on the edge." Those kinds of comments, which were not always met with enormous glee. One has to be very careful when you work together with somebody that you don't become his enemy, and you don't feel, and he doesn't feel that you're undermining. At the same time, you have to have you have to be able to be critical and have a critical faculty. So somehow it began to work.
We're always in a kind of a, tension. And I love it because, talking about our critics of the New York Times and others, they are like pussycats in comparison to Nina's penetrating eye, because she's not an architect. She just says, like, why is this looking like this? And whatever made you think of such an idiotic thing? And what is this about?
For his prize-winning Berlin designs, Libeskind drew inspiration from the paper architecture drawings which had occupied him for the previous 20 years. One in particular, called Line of Fire, a drawing from 1988, the year before the competition for the Jewish Museum, was used by Libeskind to create the shape of his finished building.
When I came to Berlin, I thought that is exactly what I want to pursue. I didn't come with a blank mind. Of course, I had to adapt this concept to the particular site. You have to pursue a line and a fire in order to be in connection with historical events.
It wasn't only the quality of Libeskind's designs that won him the competition to build the Berlin Museum. His experience of the echoes of the Holocaust in Poland and deep understanding of Jewish history uniquely qualified him for one of the most important public buildings of the decade.
Architecture is something new to Jewish people. The Jews were not architects. They were not involved in this at all. It's fairly recently that the art has been practiced.
This is the hand that takes.
One of the things I wanted to do is to transform the idea of a jüdische Abteilung. Those words truly were the most disturbing words I ever heard. Jüdische Abteilung were the words invented by Adolf Eichmann to deport Jews, the Jewish department. And I said, I'll do everything in this project which cannot departmentalized Jewish life, because Jews were not a department of history, like graphics or technology. They were citizens of the city who were not only victims, they were the creators of the great culture. And I thought that this project represented far more than a building, but a voice of someone who would speak on behalf of those who are not here.
When Daniel got the commission to design the Jewish Museum in Berlin, I think, of course, he wanted to throw everything in his own personal vocabulary at it. And who can blame him? He had been a paper architect for many, many years. Now here was his big chance. And I think in that building, of course, the symbolism is actually rather brilliant and yet, at the same time, heavy-handed. In that building, he lets us see a broken Star of David. Well, a very clever idea, actually. The Star of David was indeed broken in every sense in Berlin. And then he designs, has the windows lined up, apparently, along axes that take you to exact addresses of Jewish families in Berlin that then went missing. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's a work of glorious and deeply moving fiction that works well for the building.
The Jewish Museum is a building which is an unusual building because it's linked to a Baroque building where you enter. It's one of the largest buildings which is freestanding, which does not have its own door.
There's that magical moment trying to find the entrance and then remembering, now where is it? I know I've seen the drawings, and then having to find it by yourself that's down this strange stair, this sort of Hadean stair, dropping deep down underground.
You descend into this labyrinth, to the underground, which is a kind of an overture. It's an overture that strikes a certain triple chord, where you have an entrance into the depth of the foundations of the Baroque building, and you move laterally across, and there are three roads that open. A road that goes to the garden, a road that moves towards the continuity of the building up above you, and a road which cuts across them, which is a kind of a dead end leading to the Holocaust Tower. And that forms the ground plan, so to speak, of the museum which rises above you, which is then a kind of a zigzagging space of history through which runs this empty space, the cut in the building called the void, which is a disconnected straight line crossed with bridges. This was a museum space, but it was not an orthodox museum space. A place that is not really part of the museum, it is within the center of the museum. The museum asked me, should there be nothing here? And I said, no, it was meant to be a place of life, of an experience, of an adventure of a kind, an encounter with yourself and with history. And I think being able to walk here and hear and experience the echoes is not so far from the idea of the last act of the unwritten Schoenberg opera, Moses and Aaron. The void was the space which was meant to be the end of the music of Moses and Aaron. It was the space of silence.
The Jewish Museum project took 12 long years, politics and intrigue inexorably slowing the process. It was frustrating, and for the Libeskinds, a life full of problems.
The most difficult bit was when they canceled the project. And it came out of the blue. It came out on July 4th, 1991, and it was just a shock. We had endlessly heard rumblings and murmurings, but nothing had been as final as that. And the Senate canceled it.
I was told by the Senate bureaucracy that the senator wants to meet me And Nina said to me as we were sitting in a cafe, Kranzler Cafe, she said, you know, he's not meeting you, he's coming to tell you he's scrapped your building. I said, what? But I just won the competition. She said, it means nothing. So we came to the Senate offices. All the other models were there. He didn't want to just my model, he wanted to see all the others, so clearly was not interested in my project. We're waiting with great tension with all the people from the building department. He came late, came in a very Napoleonically, straight to me. Wasn't even looking at what was there. Came to me with his finger, and he said, Mr. Libeskind, what did you build before? And I didn't know what to answer. And then he repeated, what buildings did you do before? And I said, but Senator, it's not about... And then he said, what big buildings did you build before that qualify you for this building? And I answered, you know, Senator, if you go by the past, Berlin is not going to have any future. So he stopped a little bit. He turned to the model, which the model of the building was there, small model, and he says, how do I get into this building? And I said, you know, for you, Senator, there is no door, because there is no door to Jewish history like that. You have to first enter the Baroque building, then you go down. And as I said it, his face started changing. And after a short while, he looked at me, he said, extended his hand, he said, Mr. Libeskind, I welcome you. I like you. I like what you're saying. I welcome you to build this building in Berlin. That building depended just on that 3-minute conversation.
He talks a lot about the void, about lack of coherence, about things being shattered, fragmented, about architecture being in a kind of end condition is one of the things he talks about. What I think is important is actually the experience of the spaces which he then offers us. What interests me about his work is that it is for being in. It really gives this impression that all the time he's considering the body being disoriented, being reoriented, being forced in on itself, and being forced to be, rather than just to receive. It's not an architecture you can just look at.
Each building has to be unique. Each building has to be inscribed in its own memory. And I think it's not by coincidence that today the museum has become the stage for reinventing one's own sense of where one is, where the world is going to.
In Berlin, Libeskind is reinventing the experience of a museum. It is no longer a passive space, as the building controls you. You are being forced to think and to respond to history. A stairway leads nowhere. Empty corridors stretch into the distance. It is a building without symmetry. As you walk through, you become physically disorientated, particularly in the Garden of Exile, situated outside the main body of the building.
It's a garden, it's a perfectly ordered space. And yet, it's like all order, which has been detached from the city, a completely nauseating experience. It's an experience of instability, and yet all these pillars are in a perfect grid. They are perfectly at right angles to their ground, and yet the whole ground has been shifted, as if you were on a ship, and then everything, of course, looks distorted. It's the only right-angled form in the entire complex of the museum. We are at the end of one of the 3 streets that intersect in that underground, and I call this the dead end. It's the absolute end of what was. It's the exterminations. It's a dead end. For the longest time, I worked on this space without a single bit of light. I had it completely in the darkness. The light was something that I didn't want here. And I thought there was no light at the end of this story. And then I happened to stumble on a story of a Holocaust survivor. She said that she was on a train being deported to one of the concentration camps. And she saw through the crack of the car a white line in the sky, a white line of light. And she said, I held on to that light, and I believe I survived. And I thought, yes, I have to do something with, and I cut this very sharp line. And I always thought, you know, this tip of light is like a sword or like a knife that stabs the visitor really in the heart.
I see Libeskind's buildings, or particularly the Berlin Museum, which kind of haunts my head, as a dream. And if one thinks of architecture as dream, I think the surreal element is actually important. It's not trying to be a built model. A lot of architecture is built paper. I don't think Libeskind's is.
The official opening of the Jewish Museum to the public was the 11th of September 2001. At 2:30 p.m. Berlin time, 2 hijacked planes flew into the Twin Towers in New York, and Libeskind's life was again in upheaval.
We saw the images, somebody saw them on a computer. When I saw those towers, I turned to Nina, I turned to people around me, I said, returning to Lower Manhattan. Fateful words. September 11th changed the world. It's one of those dates that isn't just one more date. It's a date in which everything has changed. Everything has changed. It's like September 1st, 1939. The world is different.
Libeskind entered and won what everyone believed was the competition to rebuild Ground Zero.
In fact, Libeskind won the right to create a master plan for Ground Zero, which is not the same as the right to design the buildings. It was really to create a layout to determine what would go where, but not what those actual things would look like as pieces of architecture. However, his scheme, like all the other architects, by the way, not just him, contained visions of real architecture as well as just layouts. And when people became sort of invested in the Libeskind plan, they naturally became invested in some of his architectural visions as well. And naturally enough, people became invested in the idea that the buildings might actually look like that. In fact, there was no obligation to make the buildings look like that. There was only an obligation to put them where Libeskind had said they would be.
You're really looking at the memory of where the disaster happened. The so-called bathtub, the deep cut. That's where the north and south footprint of the towers stood, right here. And this whole area here, you know, there's a slurry wall, which defines that western edge towards the Hudson River. You see the PATH trains circulating back again under this world. You see the temporary station. You also see the future of the site, the memorial at the very center. You see the positioning of the Freedom Tower and how everything will come down. You see the footprints below the level, the foundations revealed. You also see the Wedge of Light, where we'll stand, the big PATH terminal and the Wedge of Light Plaza. And you also see the rest of the development as it will occur. So it's really the sort of heart and core of the memory of that day. And it's also the foundation for a response that a democratic city in New York will present to the world as a cultural response to these attacks.
I think there are several reasons that they went for Libeskind, despite the fact that New York has, unfortunately, a tradition of kind of eating architects and chewing them up and spitting them out again. There's been a shift in the culture in the last few years toward a much greater respect for architecture, a much greater interest in serious and ambitious architecture, not just in New York, but across America, if not the world, and very much in New York as well. New York has not been immune to that trend. That's one reason. A second reason was the extraordinary circumstances of 9/11 made even people who were less naturally inclined toward architecture to think that we had to do something unusual and special to respond to the gravity of this occasion, that it shouldn't be business as usual. And to respond with our highest and finest and most ambitious architecture felt appropriate. The third reason was that Libeskind's presentation was very powerful and very eloquent, and it convinced a lot of people who might not otherwise have been that attuned to his architecture. And I think the fourth reason, and maybe the most important, was the quality of the plan itself, which in fact was a very good one, which I think quite beautifully balanced the need to commemorate and honor the sacred nature of this ground and the need to move forward and renew the city.
Is this worth doing? That's all I'm asking. Well, that's, you know, or moving the line even. What if you just move the line parallel to itself? Right.
So I think if we can get it in those 2 floors.
The governor, by choosing us, and the mayor, by choosing us, went out on a limb, and Danielle and I were real outsiders coming into New York. And if there's one thing that I would have done differently is I would have recognized that fact much earlier. It took me quite a long time to recognize how deeply offended people were who had been here for decades, that somebody who hadn't lived in New York for some decades should have won this project. So this didn't have a whole lot to do with ideas, and it had a whole lot to do with networks that we were completely unplugged into.
Are you kidding? I get the faith from my relationship to what happened here. In my belief in America, my belief in New York, in my belief in those who perished here did not die in vain. If this disaster had happened in any other city, we'd still be in a discussion phase with the public for many years to come. The fact that New Yorkers mobilize themselves, the fact that people are impatient for something to really happen, and the fact they want to see the steel appearing is a good thing. It shows that this site is not something abstract to people, but it's part of their hearts.
Unfortunately, one byproduct of the way this whole thing has played out is that it looks like there's not going to be any architecture by Libeskind at all. You know, originally, it looked like the whole thing would be a kind of Libeskindian vision. And that's been gradually eaten away, bit by bit. And in fact, none of the commissions for buildings have gone to Libeskind. They've all gone to other architects. And as Libeskind's input seems to be reduced month by month, I think Libeskind's final impact on the site is disappointingly small.
What is not true is that my hand is not seen, because everything you are seeing now under construction and even the temporary infrastructure, everything is according to the plan I drew. There's, you know, you cannot build a city by talking. You have to produce drawings. You have to produce technical drawings and allow for the precision of construction, where the elevator cores are, where the entrances, where streets are, where infrastructure is, where the space for the memorials. This is all actually happening according to the master plan. So the master plan is not a figment of my imagination. It's not something that is circulating just among journalists and gossip. It is part of what the Port Authority, all the construction workers, everybody who's involved in the site, and thousands of people, are actually accomplishing.
Daniel had always conceived of other architects doing buildings on the site. He always conceived of it being a group of buildings and a group of ideas that were not homogeneous but heterogeneous, which is what New York is all about. And would he have liked to do a building on the site? Maybe initially, yes. I can tell you that being the master planner now is more than enough. And after seeing the difficulties that other people have had, however protected they have been, it's, it's a tough place to be. And people would probably not have been able to accept a master planner in New York also doing buildings. That being said, everywhere else in the universe, from St. Louis to Milan, from Singapore to Texas, one normally does a master plan and gets something on the site. That's pretty blunt, but that's what I think is true.
Although Libeskind's design for the site of Ground Zero is almost intact, his 1776-foot-tall Freedom Tower, with its shape that echoed the arm of the Statue of Liberty, will never see the light of day. What replaces it is the work of the architect David Childs.
The Freedom Tower, which at one point was a sort of Libeskindian building, and then it became an awkward hybrid of David Childs and Libeskind's ideas. Now, in the latest iteration, it's basically Childs' building on Libeskind's site. So all Libeskind has done is place it.
My role as a master planner is to make sure that David Childs, the architect of the tower, sticks within the rules of the master plan, that he delivers something that has a symbolic significance. I wouldn't praise it as a great piece of architecture. Certainly, the tower is nothing to write home about.
Let me be the devil's advocate for a minute. Are they not looking for space which is higher up?
No.
It just doesn't matter how it's distributed in terms of the...
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
No, they're not.
Libeskind's star had shone brilliantly in Berlin, but at Ground Zero it seemed to dim, as jealousy and the demands of politicians and property developers destroyed his vaulting vision. Was he to be no more than an architect of small boutique buildings, or could his celebrity status gained in New York have a positive effect? The success in Berlin meant he already had new projects in the works, and the first flush of the fame of Ground Zero had won him the opportunity to design skyscrapers. The optimist in Libeskind was turning a possible poison chalice in New York into a blessing in disguise. And the Libeskind style was about to be taken worldwide. Remarkably, Libeskind has built one small construction in memory of 9/11. It is 5,000 miles away from New York, in Padua, northern Italy, a memorial that encloses a girder from the ruins of the Twin Towers.
What I've done is raise the beam in its oblique and vulnerable position into a kind of an open book. When you look at the Statue of Liberty, she's holding a book, which is the book of the Declaration of Independence. And I thought if you take that book and open it, you can open this declaration and see the flow of history through it. And I inscribed that element, that beam, held within a very lightweight glass structure, the heaviness of that falling beam, into a kind of book of history. Some architects I know say, I won't build a building unless you give me this amount of money to build my building. I'm not an architect who costs a lot of money. Anybody who comes and asks me, says, I have $10, can you build me? Yeah, I'll say, yes, I'll do it. Yeah, it seems a worthwhile cause. Yes, whatever it is.
Libeskind's passion to take on any challenge, big or small, was put to the test when he agreed to design a simple private house on a very tight budget. It was commissioned from him by Barbara Weil, an American artist who lives and works on the Spanish island of Mallorca.
Barbara Weil is a name I heard over the telephone. She called me one day and she said, would you like to do a small building for me, Mr. Libeskind? I had no idea who she was. I came to meet her. She's an American expatriate who is a painter, worked on the island, eccentric, esoteric, And I was glad to be able to respond to her modest budget with an interesting building that works for her. I've never built anything so small with one client. It was a real experience not to have to go through huge committees and to work with one person. And I was also inspired because I've never been to Mallorca before.
Why Daniel Libeskind, that nice Jewish boy? It was great. Really, I had done an exhibition in Berlin in '97, and the gallery dealer said, why don't you do something with Daniel? He's a rising star. I created a house which is based on 365 days of the year. It's actually based on one of my drawings, which has been folded in upon itself and cut through in sections. And it's a set of memory rings. And this house is a fragment of them, created for a single person. It's a Mediterranean house, also meant to house her works on paper and other sculptures which she does. And it's a house created from the inside out. There are no external facing windows. Okay, so it's all inside. It's a cut in the landscape. And it is Spanish in a way that the steps go up and out and into the second floor and so forth. Our stairway to nowhere. It's turned out to be a monument, this building. When you asked me, I never thought it was going to be that, but that's what it turned out to be. It tells the story of Barbara Weil, the artist.
Barbara Weil's house cost $900,000.
God.
Studio Daniel Libeskind, overlooking Ground Zero in New York, remains the architect's base. Libeskind works there on a large number of commercial commissions, but still enters architectural competition when the project takes his fancy.
An angle here and here, so that you're trying to maintain the angle, right?
Yes.
But it could be a different angle here. Keep this one here, but this one just
It could.
locks
Yes.
it in. Oh, those are minor details. What about this corner here? I've been in many competitions. The first few buildings were built as a result of public competitions. But I never think of competitions as, what do they want from me? I always think this is a chance to do what you really believe in. I think competitions are ways to challenge yourself and others to do what you think is good. Why can't the circles themselves be oblique? I would make two circles, this one and this one, at two different angles.
Very nice.
So that you see it from the elevation, right?
Yeah.
Libeskind explored the themes of the Holocaust and terrorism in Berlin and New York. He then moved on to express ideas on the theme of armed conflict, winning the commission to build the Imperial War Museum North on the Manchester Ship Canal in northern England.
The competition was for a museum that would move beyond just war and equipment, a museum that would communicate the urgency of what is happening in the world today, and use only its equipment and relics of war as emblematic to tell the ongoing story of conflicts that are raging around the world and speak to the people of this northern area who fought and continue to fight in these conflicts. I had an idea at the very beginning. It's not just about a museum, it's about the world. And the world has been shattered in conflict. It's broken. And yet, you can take the pieces and realign them again. It's the world shattered in conflicts, brought back together physically on the ship canal. It's one thing to have a concept of a shattered world, but what does it really look like? What does a broken globe look like? I had a crazy idea. I bought a teapot, ceramic teapot, very cheap one, and I took it to my studio, and I threw it out of the window. And we watched the thing break. when you break the world, it opens itself, and you begin to see its surfaces split apart.
Libeskind used 3 fragments or shards from the teapot to shape his building. He says they symbolize earth, air, and water. A 4th physical shard, fire, was extinguished when the building's budget was cut.
This building has a very defined set of experiences, which Libeskind is to a large extent in control of, and wants to create a response from the visitor. The entrance to this building is very surprising, because entrances to museums, traditionally, if you go back to the Victorian Museum, are about power, going up central steps into a big grand thing, and immediately you as a visitor are kind of diminished. What's beautiful, I think, in that entrance is its modesty, that it tells you immediately that this is a building which you can engage with, almost domestic.
Visitors enter the museum through the air shard, which is open to the elements. The largest space in the museum is the earth shard, which houses the collection and a light show of the images of war.
As you walk, you begin to reorient yourself to the drama of the exhibit. Also because the world is curved, you don't see it in perspective.
He sets up this kind of landscape, which you then walk over and discover for yourself. You're helped through it by the sloping floor, you're engaged bodily with it, but you're not absolutely told to go left and right. It doesn't have that sort of sense of absolute control of a symmetrical building. He wants a sense of being slightly out of kilter. What he's trying to do is to summon up the almost impossible, which is what is the experience of war and how should we think about war? His idea of it being both intimate but civic, I think, works very well. When Libeskind was first commissioned, the budget was about £40 million. It then fell to £30 million.
Money is an incredibly important element. We take it for granted sometimes, we don't take it for granted, but I've always thought, you know, it's not about how much money can you spend, you know, get clients with the biggest budgets. I always thought, you know, what do you do really within limits? And, you know, it's my destiny. I've been involved in projects which have been public, which had very limited budgets, which couldn't go over budget. And I always thought, this is good. There are limited resources in the world.
Most architects would have had a hissy fit when your budget is cut by 10 million. He just takes it on board. He loses a major symbolic element and then rewrites the story. It was 4 elements and it's now down to 3, but he's post-rationalised that. I don't think one should have a hissy fit. You work with the budget, and he's done that. It could have ended up looking like a B&Q store, and it doesn't. It looks like something much more than that. It's a key building in a way, because it marks this kind of hinge between that very incredibly intense Jewish museum, which was, in a way, his ideal project. Only he could have done what happened there, into what he's now doing, which is taking on the world. And I think it acts between the intimacy and the intenseness of the Jewish museum and what's coming later.
After designing museums with the themes of Jewish history and global conflict, what's coming later is a museum designed purely for displaying works of art. Libeskind's freestanding extension to the Denver Art Museum uses radical engineering and modern materials and lies in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado.
When I first flew to Denver and looked over the Rocky Mountains, I was so stunned that I took my boarding pass and I just made a sketch.
My idea from the very beginning, as I explored the region and the skies, was to create a connection to the city. Everything opens into light, and light is in some way the silent partner of architecture. If you don't work with light, you would be doing just a prison. Architecture is a mechanism to throw light into your life.
Libeskind has faced a new challenge in Denver: to use his architectural style side by side with a building he admires, a 1970s architectural masterpiece by the Italian architect Gio Ponti. Libeskind's new building has to complement and not be diminished by the Italian's work.
The Gio Ponti building is nearly impossible to add to. And you certainly can't add to it by making something that looks like it. It'll just be ridiculous. And I think the only way to respond to it is either with something so totally bland that it defers completely and lets the Ponti building be the one interesting object, or with another interesting, powerful object and let the two of them try to engage. And it's that second thing that Libeskind tried to do. Where the Ponti building is primarily vertical, his building has powerful horizontals and energy lines that kind of go like this. The Ponti building kind of goes like this, and they get into a conversation. It's two different architectural languages, but I think they do work together. There's a kind of strange détente.
In Denver, Libeskind once again returned to the designs contained in his early paper architecture, using for inspiration the idea of taking two lines for a walk.
I took these two lines for a walk, quite literally. How do they merge? How do they intersect? How do they intertwine? It's just like lines of melody. You can take several different lines of melody. Architecture is geometry in space.
Libeskind has clad his Denver building in titanium. It is a modern metallic material that architects love. Forged at high temperature, it derives from black sand full of titanium ore.
Its properties are beyond belief. It's lightweight and at the same time resilient beyond the strength of any material we know. Yet it does come from Earth. It comes from processes that deal with fire and cooling. And it's the quintessential passionate material, I would say. It's just beautiful, and it captures the light in a way which steel and aluminum and other materials that I know cannot really do. It's not shiny, but it changes. There are shiny moments when it comes to the tip of the building, but at the same time there is also a darkening, and there is a flow of light on this material.
I think one of the things that most people think about so-called internationally well-known architects or famous architects are that they do a sketch and then they just get it done, and everything is fluid. Even though he may have an initial idea which is seemingly going in the right direction, he will come in, take a look at it, step back, and be completely dissatisfied with it. That's a kind of creative and artistic humility which I respect enormously. I think it's a fantastic understanding of how the world works.
Have you ever seen something like this? No.
His road from ground zero has Libeskind throwing himself into more and more work.
Very big block.
He lectures, writes, draws and enters competitions for projects all over the world. At the same time, the big global commissions are starting to come through his door. He never seems to come to rest.
He's a very, very private man, which is the anomaly in which we live today because he's become a very public figure. One of the other great strengths he has is the ability to sit on a plane or sit in his office and contemplate what he's doing and think about it, and that's an enormous strength. It's not a mechanistic approach at all.
With the jet-setting fame comes jealousy and criticism from both fellow architects and the public. He is often called, not kindly, a starchitect.
The notion that architects have names, that architecture matters, that it's about the life of peoples and not just a bunch of large-scale hair dryers and air conditioners standing on the horizon. I think the fact that the buildings have a signature makes them now part of something of culture rather than simply of mass production or consumption.
A further criticism levelled at Libeskind is that the design of all his buildings looks the same.
Every architect, if they're genuine, has a signature. That's what makes personal architecture evident. The fact is that Daniel does have a signature. The signatures lie in windows, the signature lies in geometry, the signature lies in materials. He is interested in metal-clad buildings, he is interested in certain forms, that's for sure. You cannot be but true to your own creative instincts. There will never be a building that doesn't reflect his sensibility, his creative idea, whether it is the Imperial War Museum, which are curved, or Mallorca, which is curved, or some of the housing projects he's doing now, which are curved, or other buildings which are angular. They carry the creative idea of one architect, and that one architect indeed has a signature.
In order to get rid of this problem, why don't you just raise that angle? What difference would it make? Yeah.
Raise this point.
Yes. Yeah. What difference would it make? None.
People say Mozart has composed the same thing over and over again. It's always the same. It's always Mozart. It's always the Beatles. What does it matter? That's good. You have to be yourself. If you weren't yourself, who would you be?
I'm saying really raise it even more than this. Raise it up to here. Hide this corner, right?
We live in a culture at the moment which requires almost every artist to be a celebrity. And there are many of them today, and some of them are making a great living and a great name for themselves. If you think Daniel Libeskind's world coincides with that of Zaha Hadid's, with Rem Koolhaas's, with Frank Gehry's, these are great architects who design flamboyant, dynamic, brilliant buildings. They're all stars flying up in concrete and steel and titanium and zinc, and they do excite us. Danny is very much part of that generation. What I do think he has, perhaps what the others haven't, is this great sense of the past. And I think that his sense of history, in the end, will ground him in a way that some of the others might find harder to.
Despite the disappointments at Ground Zero, Libeskind's relationship with traumatic global events is ongoing. He is designing new community housing for the tsunami victims in Sri Lanka. Studio Libeskind is undertaking the work for free, as Daniel responds personally to a plea from one of the survivors of the disaster, Ord Levinson.
I think this has developed very nicely to the issues of being able to have a certain amount of residential space, which they like there, but the commercial spaces below as well.
It's not for nothing. It's for people who lost their homes and lives. And it's how to rebuild a place that doesn't have any money, doesn't have the luxuries of what we have in the Western world. And if architecture is not an ethical profession, then what is it? It's nothing.
I arrived in Sri Lanka on the day before the tsunami and went down to Uluwatuna and was staying on the beach. And obviously was one of the survivors of the tsunami and spent 3 days there. And it seemed to me the most important element to try and rebuild was to get somebody who could understand perhaps a disaster situation, but also had the clout ability to do something. And so I wrote a blind email to him off his website and just explained the situation and said, would you help? It's brilliant, I think, actually. I think it works very well with the differences with all the others, and I think the combinations of the different types of houses.
Different types of houses, the different...
This would then be the house at twice the scale of what we're showing here.
Yes, which I think are very handsome. These.
I think they're fabulous.
And they are not... they are very easy to build, I think.
He and his team have responded quite beyond imagination, really, and coming up with solutions, which is the most important thing, to the issues. I suspect the costs will be £2,000, maybe £3,000. It'd probably be a very small sum by Western standards.
More than once a day, somebody calls with some fantastic project. There is a seduction there. You want to say yes to everything. My God, what an interesting... But also, I think about it often to myself. I don't want to, make my practice, 1,000 people and do exactly what I never wanted to do. But the pressure is there to expand, to do more and more. But this is the only thing you will read, right? Right? Yeah. This is the elevator core.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So
I'm not sure that works.
That doesn't work. What is this wall?
Libeskind has a strength in that he is an architect who will go for where the work is. Well, actually, take on anything, really. He'll have a go at it. And he's pushed on, of course, by his extraordinary wife, Nina. And they just want to reach for the stars.
And it has to pass the test that Mr. Bloch knows. That Mr. Bloch knows. The retail test, the residential test.
We have the diagram. We have a diagram. Now we do the architecture.
I think he is passionate about his work. I think with Nina behind him, who stops for nothing and no one and is profoundly focused and ambitious, the combination of the two allowed, pretty interesting things to happen.
Maybe what we really need to do is just work much more directly right from the sketch.
What we don't yet know is whether he can create a truly great building that changes the world. I think the Jewish Museum in Berlin has come very close to that, and it's one of the most important buildings of the last decade, certainly. But it's too soon to know.
Well, life has its own strange ways of rebalancing things. Okay, I spent 12 years doing one building, and now I've got to do 12 buildings in 1 year. The Greeks used to say, first you should live your life and have the very active life, do a lot of things, then retire and think about what you've done. And I figure my life is completely the reverse.
With so much work coming in, how does Libeskind choose the projects he wants to do?
If Daniel doesn't get along with the client, then the project doesn't happen. And it's as simple as that. So it's easy.
Libeskind is now designing skyscrapers in Warsaw, Milan, and Seoul. It's a form he's never worked in before, and the designs are still on paper. But when they are built, his transition from small buildings and museums to the commercial stage will be complete. His most ambitious project to date is a proposal for what could happen in Monaco, an audacious reply to the disappointments of Ground Zero.
I'm one of the very traditional architects who uses the pencil, who doesn't manipulate the images in computers. But a computer is a tool, and I don't think the buildings that I'm building now could have even been built 10 years ago. Not that they could not have been drawn, they were drawn. You have to use the mechanical, prosaic means to create the space, the ambience, the atmosphere. The big project is following the muse. Following the muse. It's not doing it, but hoping, looking, and being guided by the muse.
Libeskind's journey continues. His small signature buildings, the originality he has brought to museum design in Manchester, Berlin, and Denver, has firmly established him on the world stage as an architect of rank. His extraordinary empathy with the traumatic events of the last 2 centuries has marked him out as an immense talent, and in the eyes of many, a genius. Time will be the judge of his final achievement, but he is truly, for many people, the architect of trauma and the architect of memory. He is, above all, an architect who is passionate about the truth and authenticity in his work.
You have to love what you do. You have to appreciate, which is one level, but you have to be in love. And Maybe that sounds a little bit embarrassing to say this in public, but unless you're in love, you're dead.
Next Thursday, a brand new series exploring the images that have changed our world. The genius of photography, a definitive history, here on BBC4 at 9.
Hello! Tell me, madam, what are you wearing? Are you really?
She says she's touching herself.
Where? Between the legs.
She says she's touching herself between the legs.
Unstick.
Rob Newman's The History of the World Backwards.
You push the crotch of your panties where?
New Tuesday comedy coming to BBC4 in October.
It's back on BBC4 Newsnight with jokes. It's live, leery and topical, so strong language is a definite possibility. Marcus Brigstock with the new series of The Late Edition.
Thank you very much. You're too kind. It's like we've never been away. Good evening and welcome back to the show, coming to you live from BBC Television Centre. A very happy place today with a massive swathe of redundancies, sackings and betrayal. To be honest, the atmosphere here today is a bit like the French rugby squad's locker room last Saturday. Now, I wouldn't say that the BBC are financially inept, but I did see Mark Thompson queuing for 4 hours at Northern Rock. And when he got to the front, he said, "Hello, I'd like to open an account, please." The BBC are currently so broke that the corporation is actually going to appear on its own programme, Cash in the Attic, and try and cash in on some of the dusty old relics from the BBC archive. There he is, ladies and gentlemen. That's right, that is Sir Terry Wogan's cock and balls.
Teams bang in the middle of the table, but with West Ham 8 points the better. Still bar an unsteady, somewhat hungover display at Birmingham last time out, you get the feeling Spurs are on the up, while West Ham might be heading in the other direction. Here's Spurs losing last week, as seen by their hard-partying fans suffering from double vision.
Here's for Seoul, and it's a hat-trick!
They were hoping that the Carling Cup winners' hangover was cured for the visit of West Ham, who won't mind blotting out their last London derby. The Hammers were most definitely hammered, though Alan Kirby
Michael Dawson out of the Carling Cup final, but he's back today in the heart of the Tottenham Hotspur defence, while West Ham's injury merry-go-round continues. Matthew Upson's out, but among 4 changes, long-term absentees Scott Parker and Bobby Zamora both start the match. Freddie Ljungberg now, decent opportunity. Oh, Robinson's lost it, and Ashton was very nearly in there. And Luis Boamorte, and he's lost it again for the 3rd time. And Zamora can't put it home. And Paul Robinson was in all sorts of trouble. He couldn't get his hands on the ball 3 times there. It was a dreadful attempt at a clearance from Chimbonda. The first one got away. The second one got away. And the shot just over the top, taking a deflection. Very uncomfortable start to the match for Paul Robinson. Will have been noted by Juan de Ramos, of course. High boot from Spector. Spector playing in the heart of the West Ham defence today in the absence of Matthew Upson. Upson, a player who's perhaps perceived as injury-prone, missing for the first time this season in the league. Here's Huddleston. And it's Berbatov, and it's 1-0 to Tottenham. In the 8th minute of the game, Berbatov has his 18th goal of the season. And it's the first time that Tottenham have got near the West Ham goal. Lovely kick in here from Huddleston. It evades the West Ham defenders. And Berbatov plants it home with his head. Bang, 1-0. Over the top of Spector. And then Berbatov gets in front of Dean Ashton. Well, it's amazing, isn't it, what a goal can do? Gives you that extra half a yard, that extra bite in the tackle, that extra zip, and that's a free kick for the tackle by Ljungberg. It's not been a great week, has it, for some? It's just got a little bit worse. Plenty of time left, though. Well, Huddleston has created a goal already from a set play, and for the second time inside the first 10 minutes he'll try and do it again. Here it comes, Berbatov! Oh, it's 2-0, and West Ham United have fallen for the same trick twice. Oh, the inquest starts at the back for the Hammers now. 2 up in 10 minutes, Spurs, and Berbatov has both of them, and it was almost a carbon copy. Huddleston again, same old routine, same end product. West Ham need to wake up, the match has started. "2-0 to Tottenham. What hangover." Morto forgot the ball there. Free kick for the foul on Huddleston by Boamorte, and by a process of accumulated fouls, I think, as much as anything else, Boamorte goes in Chris Foy's book. It certainly isn't the first foul. He's not having a good Sunday afternoon out, is he, at the moment? It's Parker. Backed up by Spector. Spurs have got it now with Malbranc. Tottenham far more confident in possession of the ball than their opponents here. Just got away from Parker, and suddenly Tottenham had a shooting opportunity. Berbatov away by Spector. Lennon there, ahead of Boamorte, who stuck his foot in. Referee comes across. I think Boamorte's off here. It's a second yellow card, and it's red. And Boamorte, who was involved in the controversy with Frank Lampard a week ago, is this time the man to go. West Ham are down to 10 men just before half-time in a match they are already losing by 2-0. Now Aaron Lennon, faced by Jonathan Spector. Malbrook, deflection of Parker. Huddlestone! Very nearly 3-0. Having created the first two, Tom Huddlestone very nearly had the third all for himself. Huddlestone, there's a swagger about Spurs here. Little dummy there in towards Gilberto! Well, that's how you atone for the mistake on Thursday against PSV in the UEFA Cup. The Spurs fans were on his back a bit after that, but they won't be now, because this match is out of reach. Gilberto's first goal in a Tottenham shirt. Tottenham 3, West Ham 0, PSV next. Hutton's there ahead of McCartney. And suddenly the white shirts come piling forward. Look at Lennon go. He has options. Hutton's one of them. Green saves, and Berbatov's nearly in for the hat-trick goal. But not quite. Free-flowing football from Tottenham. Lennon's layoff. Hutton's shot. Green was a bit lucky there. Playing, looks like 3 minutes of added time here. Hutton in, great chance for 4! Last touch of the game, Darren Bent finishes it off. A great Sunday afternoon for Juan de Ramos and his Tottenham side. And for the third match in a row, West Ham United are thrashed 4-0. Anything that Chelsea and Liverpool could do this week, Tottenham could do as well. And it is a major morale booster for Spurs as they prepare to head to Holland for that vital UEFA Cup tie.
We were looking for a big reaction from the players. I think everybody can see that we got that reaction. Especially, after the two first goals, it was a little bit easier to pass around and to move the ball. So, yeah, good performance and very important for us.
A goal for you as well. You must be doubly pleased. I mean, you've had to bide your time and be patient, haven't you, this season?
Yeah, it's definitely been a change to the system. Obviously, not playing like half as much as I'm used to. But I said it's still a long way to go. I mean, I'm enjoying being here. I love playing at this football club, and hopefully I can be here for many years to come.
What about Boamorte? I mean, he didn't do you any favours today, did he, getting himself sent off just before the break?
He's an experienced professional, and he knew he was on thin ice. And
it looked reckless.
He was on thin ice, and it's the 44th minute, and he could have ushered the player out. He perhaps didn't need to make the tackle, and we've already going in 2-0 down, but we're going in 2-0 down with 10 men.
Finally, you were quite animated at half-time as the teams were coming off. Was it the sending off you were unhappy about at the time, or was it to do with one of the free kicks for one of the goals? Or
perhaps I was really disappointed because I felt Berbatov, who was 6'3", went down in 3 or 4 stages after he brought the ball down, and I don't think there was any contact. And obviously it's resulted in the free kick. Got no excuses about giving him a free header. But, the referees, they've got to do their homework,
So Alan's got the hump, and you wouldn't blame him, would you? After last 3 games, lost 3, aggregate score 12-0.
Yeah, I think he is frustrated. Well done Spurs, by the way. They've come back off the back of 2 defeats since the Carling Cup final. But for Alan Kirbishley, yeah, I mean, a week ago he was looking at pushing for Europe, and now injuries galore, 12 goals conceded. You could say he has a point, but nevertheless they're conceding early goals. And this is from that free kick. It comes in, and there's Berbatov, free header, gets away from Anton Ferdinand. You see Ferdinand here, nowhere near it. And the second goal is a carbon copy. Again, we see the 2 players circled here. Berbatov's got the run on him. Ferdinand nowhere near. And you're giving him a free header, someone of Berbatov's quality and power in the air. Here they are, circled together. Now, Ferdinand must not let Berbatov get the run on him. He's lost him completely. Now,